Okay, well, thank you to David Moscrop for coming on to the 905er to talk about the contentious issue about Catholic School Board funding in the province of Ontario. David, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Uh, this might seem a bit of a context to our listeners, but this has actually been we've been going back and forth over this for a while. And this kind of stemmed from an op-ed that you published on TVO, basically calling for the end of Catholic School Board funding in Ontario. And rather than me trying to sum it up painfully and awkwardly, I thought, why not just ask you directly? Can you kind of maybe summarize for our listeners what your argument was in that op-ed?
So the event that spurred it this time, because it's an argument I've made before, was the battle in York over the trustee decision not to fly the pride flag. And it's a battle that pops up semi-regularly in the separate school system. So it's not a new thing. And it pops up in different forms, whether it's a pride flag or gay straight alliance clubs in schools, or teacher hiring, or education programming, whatever it might be. And I use that as a jumping off point to make a fundamental philosophical argument, which was if we're going to excuse me, sorry, which was if we were going to have a public thing, which is to say a thing that belongs to all of us, that I pay for, that you pay for, that all of us pay for collectively, because that's what this is. It's not a separate funding thing where you choose where your money goes. It's a per enrollment thing. We all pay for this. If we're going to have that public thing, then it ought to adhere to public values. And we have decided collectively that those values include support for, recognition of, and respect for the LGBTQ 2S plus community and those who are part of it. And so if a board is going to use public funding and public support to undermine those public values, then we ought not to publicly support it anymore.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know that there are, this kind of stemmed from, if you're a listener to this podcast, you know that we've covered the HCDSB pride flag debate when that went on for just over a year on this podcast. And this argument popped up again during that debate. A lot of people are saying, well, why are we funding this if this shouldn't even be on the table for a school board to debate? But the counter argument we heard was always, the thing we heard from a number of trustees was the denominational rights of Catholics to have their own publicly funded school board. And that phrase denominational rights always irked me because I don't think it's a real thing. It's in the BNA Act of 1867. Basically, they said, okay, in Ontario and Quebec, you basically have to provide schooling for either the Protestants in Quebec or the Catholics in Ontario as a compromise to get the whole thing going. There's nothing about, Catholics have some kind of innate divine right to publicly funded education in Ontario. And as somebody who's done far deeper dive into the research on this, am I correct in assuming that that's malarkey? That's not a thing?
Well, the denominational rights argument is a good explanation and a bad argument, first of all. So if you say, well, why do we have Catholic schools? And someone says, well, denominational rights in the Constitution, that's not an argument, that's an explanation. That's saying this thing exists because of a political trajectory that was initiated actually far earlier than the BNA Act, but it was solidified with the BNA Act in 1867 as a political compromise to protect minority Catholics in Upper and Lower Canada. Fine. That indeed may have made very, very good sense at the time, just like one-room schoolhouses made good sense in 1867. We don't do one-room schoolhouses anymore for good reason. We've moved past that. Fast forward to now. If someone says, well, look, it's a religious right protected by the Constitution, and then you say, okay, well, then why did Quebec get rid of it? And why did Newfoundland and Labrador get rid of it in the 1990s? Obviously, that right is subject to change. It's not immutable because it's been changed. So we have a hard time explaining why you ought to keep it when others have gotten rid of it, but for the broadly the same reasons we've already pointed out. Plus, they often sort of say, well, it's, it also is good for efficiencies. You'll save a bunch of money.
Mhm.
And there's reports and data on that. I have some problems with that argument, so I sort of set that aside. But it's an argument that's made and made fairly enough. So the denominational argument, for one, is not an argument; it's an explanation. It's rooted in the past, and it's mutable because you can amend the constitutional denomination bit with a bilateral agreement between the federal government and the province in question, in this case, Ontario. You could do it tomorrow if the province had the political will and interest in doing so.
And I find that's interesting because, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the only two provinces in in Canada that have a Catholic, publicly funded Catholic system is Ontario and Alberta, if I'm not mistaken. And
I think Saskatchewan. Someone else has them. I
okay,
think Saskatchewan. There's a few, but also, it's also worth noting that the the constitutional provision is also itself incomplete because it was the Bill Davis government in the
right,
1980s that made amendments, including a push for equitable funding for the Catholic side. So it's not like we have since the founding of Ontario as Ontario had these two co-equal separate systems. I mean,
right.
the Catholic system, the separate system, is a product of history and political trajectory. It wasn't sort of baked into 1867.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because I think I'm going to argue probably about 2 generations now. We've had a publicly funded Catholic system in Ontario, and there's kind of a sense like I'm a product of that. I went to a Catholic school.
Me too.
Yeah, we'll come to that later because there's a there's another argument that I find interesting about that fact. But it's kind of this assumption like, oh, it's always been here, and that hasn't been the case. Like it was Bill Davis that really made the push as an election promise to get the Catholic vote to say, hey, I'll fund a system for you guys. You give me your vote, and we'll do it. And that's kind of how it came to be. It wasn't like this. There's always been this Catholic, this two separate funded school systems since Confederation. It's kind of there's an assumption I think the public makes on this topic.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And of course, the board has an interest in having you believe that too, the separate boards. So, uh, there you go.
Mhm.
And of course, this is such a fascinating topic for a number of reasons, including the fact that as soon as we admit that it's contingent and mutable, then we can say, well, it can be otherwise, and it has been otherwise, and it's already evolved, so it can evolve further. It's not something that's set. It's so deeply in stone that we can't change the etching or cover it up or blast the
Right.
stone away altogether. It absolutely can be, and it has been done elsewhere. And to a certain extent, we've already proven that it's changeable because we've changed it. And we've also proven that it's political in a capital P sense
Right.
of being about navigating political waters. And if you doubt that for a second, go look at the history of Dalton McGuinty talking about denominational faith-based legal avenues for Muslims,
Mhm.
and what happened when he tried to do that, or John Tory talking
Well,
about
yeah.
funding other separate faith-based schools, right? This idea that, well, no, faith-based education and faith-based legal processes are very, very important in Ontario.
Right.
Okay, that's the Catholic argument. It's like, okay, fine. And then someone says, well, then let's extend it to Jewish folks, to Hindu folks, to Islamic folks, and so on and so forth. And then it's all, whoa, 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 whoa. And then all of a sudden they run into a very, very difficult challenge, which is to say,
Mhm.
well, why shouldn't these folks have it too? And they can have these and say, well, no, because they're minorities. The response to that is, well, so were you in 1867. Or, well, it's not in the Constitution. And then the response to that is, well, then we'll take it out of the Constitution. And then nobody has it.
I find that the John Tory story always strikes me as it's always the what the proponents come back to see people don't want this. But I remember when I was knocking, I used to work for a political party, and we knock on doors during that. I remember knocking on doors at that election, And everyone said, yeah, it's a bad idea. Like we shouldn't be dividing up the public coffers for all these separate school boards. So I'm not going to vote for John Tory for that reason. But everyone always said, but why do we fund the Catholics?
Mhm.
And that, like, everyone brought that up, said, yeah, I agree. We shouldn't be funding, all these separate different school boards, just one school board. But why do the Catholics get their own? And I didn't have an argument for that, because it was something that inherently, we just know it kind of goes against our Canadian sensibilities of nobody gets preferential treatment ahead of anybody else in this country. And the idea that one religion um, kind of gets this special treatment, I think really does great on a lot of people.
And
Um,
it should.
and it should. And which kind of brings me to the argument of like the effectiveness of Catholic schools. Because I'm not going to speak for you, but I'll speak for myself. And anecdotally, when I go back to my colleagues that I graduated Catholic school from, I would argue we're probably pretty bad Catholics. I think if you want to talk about like following doctrine, there's a lot of, a lot of people are pro LGBTQ plus issues. Some of them actually are members of the LGBTQ plus community. Um, a- and there's no strict adherence to any kind of Catholicity dogma. And I looking back, I kind of say, well, didn't the system kind of fail in that regard? Like if like, what's the point of a Catholic education system if the people coming out of it aren't die in the wool Catholics?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think if we have to take this in context, and the context is that the country is becoming increasingly godless, as many developed countries are. And Catholicism is growing in some parts of the world, but in the northern part of the world, it's in decline, in structural
Mhm.
decline. The Catholic school in Ontario, at best, is fighting a rear guard action. At best, it's trying to take in Catholic students through the elementary system and educate and preserve their Catholicism through on to high school. And I went to a Catholic school. It was a very good school. I'm actually very pleased that I was able to go there, not because it was Catholic, but because it was good. And in the way that every public school should be good.
Mhm.
And I went through religious education. I attended mass. I did the whole thing. I then left and lapsed uh, later, actually quite a bit later, but later. But that process had begun already, and as it does for many. So at best, it's a rear guard action, and I think my experience is far from unique, and so is yours. But the school has an interest in fighting it anyway. And so there's that side. And then, of course, there's the material side of there's an awful lot of money and resources
Mhm.
and jobs that people are fighting for. And as a species, we are loss averse, right? This is something that's been proven by psychologists, most notably Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who did a series of experiments on this and say, human beings are more likely to want to prevent losses than to, chase gains. My dog agrees. She's very excited about this issue too.
I, I,
Slightly more excited that I'm not paying attention to her. But so,
yeah, yeah.
so you give something to someone. Say you give a dog a bone. Let's use Sam as an example because she's not allowed to have bones anymore.
Okay.
Because you give a dog a bone and you try to take it back. God help you, right? And this is
Right,
why
right.
Sam's not allowed to have bones anymore. And so it becomes much more difficult to take something back once you've given it, obviously. And
Mhm.
I think fundamentally it boils down to this: is that regardless of what the Catholics are manning, whether or not Catholics are managing to preserve Catholicism is, I think, secondary to the issue of you've given them something, and by God, you're not going to get to take it back.
I see your point, and I understand what you're saying. I always have an issue with this though, because I never talk to anyone who wants anyone my age or anyone with kids in the system, in the Catholic system, that are actively trying to preserve the Catholicness of it. The more and more parents I talk to who say, "Oh," I was like, "Why did you pick this school or this system over the publicly funded one, it came down to the fact that the Catholic schools were notably just better quality. And by that I mean they had more funding per capita for students. So the textbooks were better quality.
Mhm.
The schools, had a fresh coat of paint on it, like that kind of stuff, that you got a sense that you're getting a more bang for your buck. And the religious side came secondary to it. Was more like a necessary evil. And I don't like so I always question, like, what if they took it away? And I find more and more parents saying, yeah, one day they will. One day they're going to take it away, but they're also conceded to the fact that if they did take away the Catholicness of that school, the school itself can't go away.
Mhm.
Like we still have the same number of students, and we're still going to need the same number of teachers to teach those students. Um, there might be some closures where there's duplication. I can think of a few schools in my town of Burlington, but I think for the most part, like you're not going to see a big change. Just closing of a few board offices around the province, and the maybe a dropping of a religion class from the curriculum.
Oh yeah, no, I think you're right. And when I'm talking about that sort of risk aversion, that desire to hold on to something, that's baked into the institutional element, and the
Okay.
Catholic rearguard bit is baked into the true believers, right? Of which
Hmm.
there are many in the Catholic system,
Hmm.
at the
Hmm.
trustee level, at the board level, at the level of administrators and teachers and support staff and custodians, and right on up to the level of the Vatican, right? It is a big transnational network that is full of true believers, although not everyone is. So there's a couple of competing interests there, both material and spiritual, self-interested and ostensibly other interested, or not narrowly self-interested. But for the parents' side, there's certainly parents who want their kids to go to Catholic school because it's religious.
Hmm.
But I think for many of them, the first concern is the quality of education.
Right.
And but that is the empirical question I think is most important. Was, okay, well, if we were to do away with these schools to have a more inclusive single public education system, could we maintain or even grow the quality of public education in Ontario? Now, my hypothesis is that we could grow it and make it more inclusive at the same time. If that's wrong, I'd be willing to revisit my approach, but I don't think it's wrong.
Yeah. My inclination is to say that's the case. More money going into one system, I think, is the way to go.
Yeah,
Um, but I do find your assertion of, I find I'm arguing with you for no really good reason, but it makes for a good podcast. But
sure.
your assertion of there's too many vested interests, and I do question that, only because when we were covering the Halton Catholic pride flag debate, and I would point out probably as well this the York Catholic pride flag debate. I know for a fact, like, a number of parents wanted refer to the diocese, to the local the bishop, to say, can we get a ruling? What does the church officially say on this matter? And every time the church kind of said nothing. Just there was no response. I thought, if you're looking to, now, part of me, I took that as an inclination of they were smart. They realized, no, if we start saying um, the LGBTQ plus community has no place in our schools, the march to secularization would be a foot on the gas pedal, so to speak. So I think they kept their mouth shut on that. But also the fact that they weren't able to say anything tells me, like, they kind of know that the march is going towards more secularization, and it's kind of this quiet remittance to that notion.
M- More
Uh,
secularization and also liberalization, right?
Yes, yes, yes.
And this reflects a sociological and spiritual battle that's happening, both socially in Catholic communities and beyond them, and within the Catholic Church itself. Now, I don't want to overstate the case, but you could, as rough types, draw parallels between that and the last two popes. Very famously, Cardinal Ratzinger, who would later become Benedict the 16th and then later Pope Emeritus, said the equivalent of, better a church of one than a church that ignores its doctrine. And as head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and a staunch Orthodox Catholic,
Mhm.
that approach was no, we need to protect what is fundamentally Catholic and a very conservative reading of Scripture, and then there's no sort of space for giving that up. If we give that up, what's the point? So that's where you would get the sort of descendant of that is, okay, we're not going to raise the pride flag at schools, and we're not going to have ally
Right.
clubs and so on and so forth, because it's contrary to our doctrine. The new Pope Francis, has a slightly more liberal approach to these things that reflects the changing times. It's not exactly liberal as we conceive of it, but certainly more liberal than the last Pope. And that struggle's ongoing in the church. And I think it's ongoing all the way down to the level of individual schools and boards, because they do take different approaches, because some school boards do fly the flag. Some schools,
Mhm.
many schools do fly the flag. Schools now have to have these clubs, but some of them welcome it, right?
Mhm.
And they are openly accepting because they are more liberal, and then some don't. So that struggle is ongoing, and it's been ongoing for in some iteration for a very long time.
I would also add to that, I think a great deal, many of kind of on the ground Catholics, at least, this is all anecdotal. I don't think anybody's actually done a study on this, so I don't have any data to back it up, but it's all anecdotal on my front. Is I think the confirmation of the sexual abuse scandals that the Catholic Church had to face, as well as the uncovering of unmarked graves across Canada, has kind of led to this. I think a lot of people question. I don't want to say questioning their faith, but questioning the institution of, how can you be preaching one thing and yet you've been doing this horrendous, these horrific acts institutionally for not, at least 100 years.
Mm.
And I think for at least a good many Catholics, they say, no, why am I going to listen to what you have to say? Or why am I going to partake in what you're describing as beneficial for me, when quite frankly, like what you do behind closed doors is horrific. Uh,
Yeah. Well, the
and I
Catholics have a response to this, and it's a very convenient response. And it's a response that we've been hearing for a very long time, which is, oh, yes, that's true. A man is fallible.
Right.
Right. And it's like we've had, this is the church that had anti-popes, right? This is the
Right.
church that had the Borgias. They have encountered not, absolutely nasty, vicious, abusive, terrible, hellbound Catholics before. And the
Mhm.
response is, oh, yeah, they're bad people. They may very well end up in hell. They haven't, they aren't truly open to the word and love of Christ, and, they'll get theirs. But there's still good in the church, and so let's focus on that. Now, of course, but the response is, well, first of all, it's an institutional problem because it is institutionally prevalent, and the institution proceeds to cover it up and to support these folks, and moving, they move around abusive priests,
Right.
and they cover the scandals and the abuse up, and that's a fundamental problem of the church, not of individuals. It's also individuals, but it is an institutional problem too, because it's the institutional seeking to preserve itself and minimize scandal that commits these crimes, as well as what you would think would be sins. But then they just come back and say, okay, well, yeah, but that's, again, it's just we are fallible human beings, and this is the sort of thing that happens. um, so it's a very, very convenient argument. But any other organization who would try to do something like that, you would say, well, we'll tear it all down, replace it from the studs up, if not
Right.
just, reduce it to rubble, because it's so rotten to the core that we're not going to sacrifice vulnerable people to these folks, because it's torturous to do so. But the church is big and powerful, as much as they want to pretend that they're a cowering minority. They're big and they're powerful, and they have a lot of, at least assumed, political power. Maybe we could talk about this, because this is also fundamental to the debate. There's an assumption that touching this is the third rail of Ontario politics.
I'm glad you brought it up, because I was going to lead there in our next bit, because in a previous life, I used to work for I used to work for the Ontario Liberal Party, and I talked with people in the Ministry of Education at the time, and I brought this up. I said, why don't we stop the funding of Catholic schools in Ontario and just fund one system? Like, why you guys can change it? Why don't you? And the response every time was, well, twofold. One, the Constitution argument, which I think we've kind of debunked um, uh, earlier. But the second one was a little bit more nuanced. Was the argument was the Catholics will rise up against us and we will lose power in the next election.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just kind of said, all right, I guess so. But I also said, have you been inside a church lately? They're not really like filled to the brim of Catholics, and the ones that are in there, they're, they might only have like a year or two left. And I don't mean to be callous about it, but like I'm being realistic. Like the as an institution, it's not filled to the brim with young, vibrant, energetic people. And I'm thinking like it's the idea that the Catholic, the Catholic base, if it is there, is going to rise up and turf out, whether it's Doug Ford or whoever the Liberals or the NDP pick next time around if they do this.
Yeah, and I think the voters are one thing. I mean, the sort of Catholic voters who will make this a voting issue and the voting issue. And the other thing is the institutional power. And I think it's one thing to say, well, we don't want to upset and take on the segment of voters. Like, okay, fine. I'm not super convinced that it's as big a deal as they say. Maybe it is. But I think they look and say, well, we definitely don't want to pick a fight with the unions. And if I were a teachers union, and I'm looking at talking about, one single public system, and I'm looking and saying, there's an awful lot of people talking about efficiencies and saving money, I might start to get nervous, and rightfully so. This is something I haven't written about, but I have thought about, which is if we're going to do this, in fact, we're going to talk about doing it, we really need to be clear, and we really need to do it in such a way that protects and preserves education funding as it is, and that any efficiencies, quote unquote, or redundant money that is taken or saved through eliminating one system is poured right back into the system, including maintaining, if not ideally improving, the ratio of teacher to student. And I think if I'm a government, God help us all, if I'm in government though, and I'm making a decision like this, I'm saying to the unions, this is a decision that's going to benefit you because we're going to take all of this extra capital infrastructure nonsense we don't need, all of these kind of overhead administrative positions way up the board, sort of well-heeled administrators who are doing just fine. They're not teachers on the front lines. And we're going to put that money back into frontline education, into education workers, both teachers and support staff. I think that's a winning argument for the unions and for the province to say, well, when we make the system more efficient, we're not going to cut. We're going to make sure that there are more teachers for students, and that's good for everyone.
Well, that's the thing is that, you sit down, you kind of do the math. I haven't actually done the math, but the students aren't going anywhere, right? And so the fact is you're still going to have the same number of students that need to be taught. You still need the same teachers to teach them. You just say to basically ETFO and to OSSTF, basically the corresponding teachers now become part of your unions. Like, and I think you could, if you're a government of the day, if you were able to sit down and negotiate this in good faith, say to OECTA, the Catholic Teachers Union, you're no longer there, but your members are now going to be absorbed into these other unions. I think that would temper like the hesitancy of it. You're right. The problem is a lot of big plans like this. The announcement is made, but then all the details afterwards are kind of bungled.
Well, exactly. Or, folks look at the government and say, well, I don't trust you. It's the Ron Burgundy gif, right? I don't believe you.
Well,
and I'm like, yeah, fair enough, right? I mean, if I would be awfully nervous, especially when governments are talking, sort of austerity governments are talking about efficiencies, I would be nervous that you say, no, don't worry, we'll keep your job. And then that doesn't materialize because they're like, well, we can save, X hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars. Well, we're just going to save it. We're going to just sort of plow that into
Right.
paying down the debt or something like that. So I do understand the nervousness, but you've got to do it in the right way. And actually, you know what? I would I would have to really take a minute and think if you said to me, uh, we can get rid of Catholic education and make it public, but we're gonna, cut all of these teacher positions in the process to save money. I'd be like, I got to think about that. So, I mean, I truly believe from a labor standpoint, you've got to protect the positions, which
Mhm.
is also going to, and indeed extend them, use that money to pay more teachers, uh, hire more teachers. Then you produce better education, right? So this idea
Mhm.
that, well, Catholic schools are better, and so we need to keep Catholic schools. This is a common thing. The counterpoint is, or we spend that money to make schools better for everybody. Because right now,
Right.
implicit in that argument that, oh no, Catholic schools are better, but also they can't take everyone is, well, you're shit out of luck if you can't get into a Catholic school, which you can't if you're non-Catholic as an elementary student, and you
Right.
can later in high school. So we're saying, oh, it's okay to kind of leave all these students off to the side because these ones are doing fine, instead of taking all the energy and resources and making sure that everybody is better, which is what I would rather do, while also respecting the fact that as a public system, we ought to be maximally inclusive of all people who contribute to that system and who live within it.
The other side that people don't take into account is kind of the overlap. I mean, if you go through any community in Ontario, a lot of the time you'll see a public school, and then across the schoolyard is the Catholic equivalent. Because back in the day, these schools were built when kind of Protestant and Catholic populations in a given neighborhood were pretty much 50-50. And so you just say,
Yeah.
okay, they go there. Over the time,
Sharks and
those
the Jets.
yeah. Um, interesting analogy, but pretty much, yeah. And then, but over time, obviously, those demographics have changed. I can think in my home here in Burlington, there's one neighborhood that is basically the boomers have never left, and so the the young families are not moved in to replace them, and the populations for two schools are
Mhm.
dwindling. And I said, these schools are black holes of tax dollars. And I sound like a conservative here, but it is a valid argument. It's like, okay, but wouldn't it make more sense to just shut one down and send all the kids to the other school? And so that school now becomes full. They're maximized in terms of population. You sell off the other school, and you can turn that into hopefully socialized housing or a park or something. I don't know, but you sell it off, and that money can go back into the school system to buy smart boards, textbooks, Wi-Fi. I don't know, whatever you want to do with it. Um, but I imagine, and I got to think like this situation is not exclusive to the 905. This has got to be happening all over the province of just those schools that, yeah, the demographics in the neighborhood have changed, and we really only need one school now. We don't need two.
Oh yeah, and it's wildly inefficient to say, well, I know there's a school across the road and everyone can go there, but it's a different kind of school, so we're gonna have to bus you over here instead. And now you
Right,
can't
right.
walk or bike ride to your school or walk your kids over to school in the morning because, sorry, that's a Catholic school and you can't go there. And so
Yep.
we're gonna go over here. Or it also becomes a sort of bad allocation of resources at the capital level, at the infrastructure level, based on, as you mentioned, this ancient division between, well, I called earlier the Sharks and the Jets, which is just silly in 2022. So I mean, there's again, that's a functional reason to do away with it. So I mean, I think the argument to do away with Catholic schools is good, both at a sort of functional level and a symbolic level. I should say, no, they're both functional. I should say a symbolic level and a material level.
Mhm.
And you could say to me, I have no time for the voucher argument, so that I dismiss out of hand. We need a public system funded by the public for the public, so vouchers are a non-starter for me. But look, if you want to have a private school for Catholics that you pay for out of your own pocket, fine, whatever. That's going to be a tiny minority of enrollments. Go for it. Those things exist. But if they're going to have a public system, it ought to be public for everyone.
Well, I think the only communities that would house a private Catholic system would honestly be Toronto, maybe Ottawa. but they'd be heavily urbanized centers, because that's the only people who'd be able to afford a fully privatized education system.
Yeah. I mean, I'd prefer those didn't exist, but I'm not that's not where I'm going to draw my line, especially if it's something that helps us facilitate having a better better single public system, which again, here's a thought experiment I often use to try to upset our tendency to rely on path dependence as a justification for current policy. And it's this. Say we were to have a big constitutional convention 2023, we're going to found Canada again, setting aside all the deeply problematic layers of problems with that, the fact that we are a colonial state that sits on quite a bit of unceded land and is based on the genocide of Indigenous people. That is a significant part of that. But say we were just going to talk about education and how we design the education system from the ground up constitutionally, and you put the question to people, okay, citizens, residents of Ontario, we're going to have a system, an education system. You're in charge of it. How do we design it? No one is going to say, oh, we're going to have a separate Catholic school system, and then we're going to have a public system for everyone else. That's just simply not what we would do. You would get probably a convergence on the idea of a single public school system, or many separate systems, which would be a massive mess, but you get the idea. No one would settle for the fact that you simply have a public system and a separate Catholic system. No one.
And I think that, I guess what it comes down to for me is that I think the public is on board with that. I think there's a great, if you ask Joe and Jane front porch, what's their idea of the two systems in Ontario, 9 times out of 10, everybody, regardless of their background, is going to say, no, we should have just one publicly funded board. All of our kids, Muslim, Jew, Catholic, Protestant, atheist, whatever, we all go to the same building. We all learn 1 + 1 = 2. And I find that this is a case, once again, of the political will is woefully out of touch with what's going on the grassroots. That you ask anyone running for political office, and they are scared of this topic. But on the ground, everybody says, no, there's, there should only be one system, and everybody gets to go to it, whether you're LGBTQ plus, Black, Native, it doesn't matter. We all, just one system for everyone. And it's just like a case, like, once again, our political class is just out of touch with what's going on the ground.
Oh, I think they're, I mean, in a sense, they're in touch in the sense that they probably realize in their heart of hearts that the system is absurd and that people would be better served by a different one, and lots of them prefer it. I mean, there is polling data on this. I haven't seen the most recent stuff, but there is data that exists, and people sort of say, oh yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the Toronto Sun even once had a thing running, they ran a thing that was like, people want to get rid of the system and have one. It's like, okay, so I know for a fact that someone like Doug Ford probably knows this to be true, because I have a feeling he's read the Sun. So that's for sure the case. I think they're out of touch in the sense that they are unwilling to take the next step to execute. And now that I think on it a little bit, out of touch might be a bit unreasonable, because I think this issue is important, and I think people are behind the reform, but I don't think they care enough to really press it at either the sort of activist level, or to make it a social movement issue, or something they've organized around, or to make it a ballot issue. I really don't think it ranks that high, even though it should, right? And I think that's part of the political calculus, is that if everyone tomorrow said, this is my ballot box issue, so the next provincial election, this is the thing on which my vote's going to be decided, someone would probably come along and say, okay, then let's do it. But even the NDP doesn't want to touch this, right? Because they're like, it's a big pain for a little return. So the political calculus is off. So in that sense, I would say parties are very much in touch with the political calculus,
right,
and out of touch with public preference.
But kind of coming back I guess, bring this conversation full circle, initially we want to talk about the fact that the York Catholic Board said no to waving the pride flag. We initially started talking about it because the Halton Catholic had a year-long contentious debate on the topic. Niagara Police said that the Niagara Catholic Board had a lock and secure policy because of a threat made against that board. And then I guess I'm saying like this, I don't see this issue going away. And it seems to be focused, it's going to keep coming down to the Catholic boards because I think that's where, um, the social conservative right, they're copying from the American playbook and they're trying to infiltrate the public, the school boards to in impose this agenda. And I'm just wondering if that public grassroots groundswell is going to start building up over the next few years, because or maybe it's a question of the left can't get its act together on this topic, as long as pride flags still become an issue.
I think it is going to remain an issue. I do think, however, though, to return to a bit of the conversation earlier, that the school system, the separate school system, just strategically may adapt and sort of, put some water in their wine, to borrow bits of an old story from their book, uh, to try to head off growing public sentiment against them, right? Because if they keep fighting this
Right.
battle time and time again, they're going to keep reading stories by people like me and you who say, okay, don't fund them. And they're going to keep turning public opinion against them. So there's a sort of social pressure that's going to force them to adapt slowly, for sure, but adapt nonetheless. And if they don't give into that, they're probably goners at some point, because at some point that's going to raise to the level of the public just being simply done with them, and wanting to say, okay, no, it's finally time to get rid of this. And the political calculus might change. And then once it does change, that's that. If we do reach a critical juncture, we could very well decide to take it and end that system. So I think the church is going to be the church and the school system will be guarding against that. But it's going to be an internal debate, because that means trading off some of their approach to dogma and
Mhm.
to doctrine. That's their decision. But the left could organize around this in the meantime, and I think they should. But the institutional party left isn't exactly having a great moment, so I'm not
Mhm.
putting a ton of faith in them to sort it out.
Oh, I'm not either. We've had a number of conversations, and just the lack of cohesiveness of the left and how it tends to
Mhm.
eat itself over these issues. I would kind of my last point on this. I do think I do think that the march towards the end of the Catholic school system is here. We're already on it, and the reason why I say that is there's greater and greater push for a lot of these uh, legal arguments of to preserve the Catholicness of these schools, such as not allowing non-Catholics to register for the school, or to discriminate in hiring practices uh, to the schools. I want to say that it's not. I don't know of any cases legally, but I can see down the road that being challenged in the courts to say you cannot, despite what the Section 93 says, you can't discriminate somebody in hiring or admitting to a publicly funded school based on their religion or lack thereof. And I think at some point somebody's going to bring that to the courts, and the Supreme Court will no doubt say, yes, we would definitely want to hear that case. Um, in which case, once that happens, I can picture just it's going to be like a wall of dominoes just coming down, because once you allow non-Catholics in, what's the point?
Yeah, I mean, I I don't think we're ever going to see a successful challenge to the funding, but I do imagine we could see enough of a forced liberalization
Mhm.
of the system that, I mean, I already think the what's the point argument is compelling, because it's so watered down already, having
Right.
gone through it myself and seen others. But you could, I mean, it's already, you can opt out of religious classes, Catholic,
Yes.
for instance, right? So you don't even have to take religious classes. As for mass, we used to have a strategy for that as well. We'd hide in the bathrooms.
Yeah, it happens now.
They used to post teachers at the doors because they
Yeah.
knew that everyone wanted to skip mass and go and have a smoke or go down to pizza or something, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
they'd
yeah.
have to. This is how deeply Catholic the Catholic schools are. The point where you've got to police students who are hiding in the bathroom stalls with their feet up on the toilets so they don't get spotted under the stalls. And then trying to sneak out the back door to have a smoke. I mean, right? I mean, what are we doing here?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, if we're going to swap stories, at my Catholic high school, we used to convert the gym into a church.
Us too.
And then, but every now and again, you'd hear the side door for the gym just quietly opening and closing as some kids figured now's my chance to sneak out and go for a smoke.
When everyone's bowed their heads to pray,
yeah, let us pray. And he hears, right as his door opens.
The Lord must have moved through them. The Holy Spirit, sorry, the Holy Spirit moved them
right, and then
out the door.
It's an age old thing, and but what I find it's interesting. I have kids in the system now, and they're getting to the age where they do the sacraments through the school,
mm-hmm.
and the number of other parents who are coming forward saying, "My kid's not even baptized. Like they got in because I've got the right credentials to get into the school."
Right.
And I find that story becoming more and more prevalent. And I say, like, it's not like the one-off. Like there's, in some cases, we've heard of some classes for communion and confession that there's just like an entire section of the classes. No, we're not participating because I don't want to. And I just want to, like, it's kind of like you're fighting an uphill battle on this if you're trying to preserve it. I do think the trend is going that it may not be within your or my generation, but my gut tells me the next generation, definitely they're just gonna say, no, we're done with it.
Yeah, I think that's just demographically true, right? I mean,
this is all anecdotally. I really don't. The thing is, I don't think anyone's ever done the actual hard data research, like no polls or anything have been done on this. But it's just anecdotally. Like I talk to anyone, go to a church, and you'll just see, like, no, this is not. It's not a vibrant system that is showing, oh, there's definitely like a generational renewal happening here.
Yeah, and here's the thing. I mean, structurally, the religious population in Canada is declining, and the Catholic population of Canada is declining. So, that's just the structural reality. And as people age out, which is what's going to happen, and they die and they're replaced by less religious offspring, that's going to be that, right? So I remember it hovering around something like a third, something like that. And I think right now, I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think, unreligious, atheist, agnostic, whatever, is getting pretty close to about the same, if not higher. So, I mean, you're going to lose to demographics every time in the long run.
Well, I think I think you and I could have this discussion for another, like, for the rest of the day, but I do know we're coming up on our time and we both have to get on with our day. So David, I'm going to call it an end to this episode, but thank you very much for coming on to discuss this topic. I doubt it's going away anytime soon. But we'll have a link in our show notes to his article from the TVO website for all of you to read when you get a chance. And thank you, David, for coming on to the 905er.
This was a fantastic conversation. Thanks so much for having me.
Wonderful.